Good evening, everyone. It's a privilege to stand before you and just testify God's story in my life. Just like how we've been promoting about this DTS, it's called His Story, which is our story.
Koe tapuaki ke mo ui e ku fotua tu heni ke vahe te sisu klaisi kai tau te fito ki he ako fatia ti sai pare koni amana ke mau whakalele ai kui koe talanoa koe o tua koe ku talanoa ai koe ngā koe ngā ue o kune whai pe o mana ke ne whai he kumoi.
So I'm going to share my story, which is God's story in my life. And I come, like what my husband was saying, you know, I'm firstborn generation, born in America, which means that my parents immigrated from Tonga to America in the 70s, and I was born there.
O hangi koe mena e laugea ku kusipani di kumau koe talanoa koe te talanoa ke ai te vahe atu ai talanoa ke ngau e tua whahe mo ui na whanau iau i Amerika koe na hiki te uoma doa pe mitongani whinu futupu pe whanau iau i Amerika.
Yeah, so I come from a Christian family, and I was raised up, you know, with the Tongan culture. I was brought up in going to Sunday school, going to church, and so my parents really, you know, even though being raised up in a foreign country, being Tongan and, you know, living in another country, my parents still try to teach us the traditions, our Tongan traditions, and as well as the gospel.
Neo mau na tupa ke fonua muri kana whinga lahi pe ko matua ke a ko i te mautolo ai ngahe ulunga nga whakafonua whakatonga e mau ke lotu mau ke lotu tonga mo e ngahe ala me pe.
And as you know, one of the reasons why my parents immigrated out from Tonga to foreign land is because they were seeking for either better education for their next generation or, you know, better jobs and stuff like that. And so for me growing up, you know, I finished high school. I took the opportunity and, you know, I used that as finishing up going to school.
Hage koe tolahi tau tolu I tonga ni tau wat ki muri ko ngā ko kumi mo ui pe koe tau kumi hawhainga maarie ki he tau whanau pe koe ho tau tō tangata hoko pe a mau e whainga maarie ke aloi ke hako mo whakaosi ai high school.
So even in my education, you know, I was so thankful that my parents, you know, brought me up in the Christian values, but at the same time I didn't know what it meant to have a relationship with Jesus.
Whaftai ki o tua ko whiwhia ko ngā ko tokanga o mātua ke āweau ki he ako pe mo ohia ke au. Kana ia e mea na ke mahino I au ai mahuinga ki aha to wafa fo yudu pe mo tua.
And so I think I was, you know, throughout my high school, you know, I go to the Sunday schools, went to the youth groups, attended, you know, choir practice, and, you know, I came to know God, but I just didn't know have that relationship with God. But it wasn't until when I got to university where my life was a bit different, and that's where I encountered God.
Na lai taipu aloi ki ngahe u ki he ngahe u pongau e talavo aloi ki ngai whakataanga ki he kehe pe a taipu na wai o Aluke University na ia e kamata ke liliu e mo uia ke mea kehe.
Yeah, and so it was, I think, maybe my third year in college when I was studying. You know, I had a dream, I had a plan. I wanted to study this. I wanted to go into this profession. And I had a whole plan set for my life. But I think one thing that was missing was that my relationship with Jesus. And I was beginning to live a double life.
I he Lotonga University na e o sei palania ku ko me e te fai pe te alo ta fa koe pe fa o singa me a koe pe tempo na I he ya pe a koe na e ko mo ui na ko ngawa na ko ngawa mo
Yeah, and so when I was living that life, I was, on Sundays I was going to church, but then from Monday through Friday I was doing something that was not godly.
Taimi ko na o I Sabate ko alo ke lotu ko wike na fire me na kai ko hangai me whakautu wai.
And then it was one Sunday when I went to a church service with one of my friends, and then God spoke to me through scripture, and He says that it's enough. Stop living this double life. You need to choose whether you're going to follow me or you're going to follow this way.
Aho taha na mawala ke lotu pe hanga he la maria mau no ni o convince me pe ne hanga wai o loto. E rea ma ke te au. Ke whiunga e ku nofo I he mo ui vei wa ka whai ha whiri ko whe hala te whowai. Pe te alu e ala koe, pe te alu e ala koe.
So I was 24 years old at that time, and I was still young, as a young person, and still seeking. But then God spoke to me through this verse in Psalm. It says to commit your ways to the Lord and trust in Him always. And it was in that verse where God really spoke to me. And out from this service that I went straight back home to my dorm room, and I just sat there and I just recommitted my life to Jesus again.
Pea toi tuku ho tua ves fola koni ai mau inga ke recommit pe toi foaki e mo ui maana. Pea au ke taimi ko na pa foki ai ki o mau ke o nofo anga o toi foaki mo ui ma Jesu Christ.
And so it was there where I started to choose to live a righteous life, to make changes in my life. And long story short, that's when I met my husband to be.
Pea whaire vai whakapapau mo ui koe halain te whauai, pe he taim te tau pe mawhetau lake.
And it was this time where God really started to speak to me more about missions and about evangelism. So for me, I had no idea what evangelism was about.
Pea e taimi koe ma whiohi pea kamata ke lea o tua ki ai whikau aku pea moe pe ngā ue whamisnare pe koe alu he ngā ue pe koe pea mono malanga e koe gospel.
So, for me, I had my own dreams, but then my husband had his dream to use music as a way to preach the gospel. And when he was sharing his dreams to me, it wasn't that my dream was insignificant, but I was questioning myself, what am I doing? And what is the purpose of studying this profession? Is this what God really wants me to do?
Taimi koe na mawhetau lake ai, pa ne wahe mai ai le misi pe koe ne visione, pea wahe anga mo visione, koe taha unga u alo ki Amerika, ko whaam ke ngau ake musiki ke malanga e gospeli. Pea ne whakaukau pe he, koe ha aonga e whai e mea koe ni. Ko tiu mau inga ke te komite te mo i ke te alo whai ha mea ui ki te e ki whai.
And so education is an important part of our life, and it's not something, yes, we need to give up education to go into missions, but that maybe God has a plan for what gifts and talents that we have to be used in missions.
O ku mau inga upi te alu ki he ako, pe o mau inga pe mo inga he mea ke heke. Ka e lava pe he o tua, ke ne hanga ngau e aki, ai ngahi utare niti kou ke mau, o ka wai ka pau hato taha koe ku yaha o passion ki he ako. E lava he o tua ke ngau e aki, ai gift ko ia une o atu ko ia, I he mission pe koe ngau e whamisnare.
So for me, what I was studying was I wanted to become a lawyer. I wanted to become someone that would stand up for our people's rights and to help our community, our Tongan community back in Hawaii. But then when I became to know and encounter God even more, God was speaking to me like, okay, so if that's what you want to do, then how can I apply this going into missions?
Ko au kong tau mua ke u hoko ko hato taha loea pe taimi koe na uku kamata ke whanonga ki he eiki pan kamata ke ne liliu mo ui pa whairewa ai whehui ko ni ki ai e anga whewhe haku hau pe mo e visone ko ni pe ko misi ko ni ke ngau e aki I he ngau e whamisinare.
And so, I was seeking God and praying to God. I was like, okay, how can I do this? And in my mind, being brought up in America, we have this thing called the American dream, where you want to have the nice cars, the nice, have a good family, a place to live. And that was the life that I was trying to live. But it wasn't bad to have the American dream. It's just that I just didn't have God in that dream.
Pea hange ko mo mea I ko I tupo ke ko ni fonua ko Amerika ko ngai miss pa Amerika ma o ngai mea le ko ga mea ko ke kovi e te ma o ngai ko lo le I pe mo hafua ka ko mea ko na sio ko na tono no wai o ke ko ngai dream ko ni ko ke ka wai o tuai ko tu ko mea fa tuai.
And so, long story short, we got married, we had a son. And at the same time, we're both seeking as a family, okay, what do you want us to do? Where do you want us to go? And during that time, and as we're seeking God, I felt like God was calling me to go into missions.
Pea time ko na mamari ai ma ho ma fo Lalahi pea malotu ki o tua pe ko ha ko ai hoko atu o e mafononga pea maongo me ki o ku ke maalu ke nga famisnare.
So I know it was a choice that I have to make because I had to sacrifice my own plans and my own dreams that I had. But at the same time, I know that God will use that plan in the near future.
Pea ko tui, ko ilo, ko I he liriwa ni ko pau ke whai e whiri. Pea ka ko, pe e taimta tau pe ko hanga o whoaki ai palani ma ngai whotutu ko ni. Pea u whenga ke whalala ke o tua, pea mui mui, ka nau tui pe, iai pe aho, I hanga o tua, o ngau ake ngahi misi ko ni, I hene whaunga pe ana, I he kahao, ko hinga ke tokoni ke langa hano pureanga.
Yeah, so when I finished university, it was kind of hard for my family to understand the decisions that I made, going into full times into mission, but at the same time, I knew where God was calling me to go.
Pe taimi na whaia e ku ospe university pe au vai ko family he kai ke te hoko atu au ia te alo ke ngai famisnare ko me a whainga ta au wido nia ke tari o family a decision pe ko fili ko ni o ko whai.
So in 2010, that's when me and my family, we moved to YWAM Perth in Australia, and that's where I did my discipleship training school.
I he wawhengo fulu pe a mau whetukutuku atu ki Australia, ki whetuku atu ko Perth I Australia, I whakahivo ko Australia, pena e whai ai a ne ako whakatisai pare ai.
Yeah, so for some of us, we may have did our discipleship training school while we were a young person, but for me, I did it when I was married and I had a family.
Mahalo pe o ku tolahi pe tamai ki nau to nau ako whatisai pare he nau ke iki to tupu ka koao nau to o au ia ai ako whatisai pare ko was maria pe was ai whanau.
And so it wasn't just me doing the discipleship training school, but it was my whole family and learning how to be a family in missions, in this new call that God was calling us into.
Ka ki ngata pe ia te au na ku whai ako ko ni ka ku kau mai ai pe foki o ku family hono ko toa.
And so one thing that I've learned from taking this discipleship training school was that there's so many topics, but one of the key topics was hearing God's voice.
Pea ko taha mea I he ako whatisai pare o wanga he uto piki wako o wako o mai ka speaker wako I he wiki ko toa pe. Ka ko taha ni ai to piki na ako lahi mo ui ai to piki ko te whanongo mauinga ke te whanongo lava ke te whanongo ke reo o toa.
So all my life I knew God, and then I was born again and I recommitted my life, but at the same time I just didn't understand the concept of hearing God's voice. I knew that God was speaking, but I just didn't know that I can hear from Him.
I he talo ku tupu hake ku mo ui na whak taria sisu whake ku mo ui maana pa ngawe maana kana keki hanga uia I loi mo mahi noi ai koe haa koa ai uhinga o e whanongo ke reo tua pea na keki I loi te ulava ke whanongo ke ono reo o tua.
So it's not that I wasn't hearing from God, it's just that I didn't recognize his voice.
O kai ko hinga ine o kai ke ko hahano whai ngā hinga ko uinga nai kai peke o hanga uia o ilo i ko o gurea mai pe o tuai ka te au. Kana ke ilo ia ko re o ia o tua.
And so it was, through this discipleship training school, it's just a foundational course in YWAM that, we take. It's all about building character. It's not about knowledge, but it's about building character. And for me, hearing God's voice was so significant for me because at the same time, now I can be dependent on God and not on my own thinking.
I hea ko whakatisai pare o ku nehanga toko nii i te taimu te kawe hea ko ke langa mo ke langa hake a natula mo ulungaanga whakaotua i he te mo'ui. Ka koe i he taimu ni ko lawai ke whanongo ke reo i o tua o ku ne whakatupu au pito ai whalala i te au mo e lava ke uhi ke te ia i he mea kotoa peko whai.
And so from that point on, when I began to develop that relationship and encounter God even more intimate with him, when I began to start hearing him, every decision, every choice that I make, I always go to God and ask him.
Pe kono whakawhawhai ni e lava koe ki whanongo ke rea o tua, koe ngahi mea kotoa peko whai, pe koe mea o ku whiri ke whai, o ku alu ke o tua, o whanongo ke e kentala mai,
So it's been maybe 16 years now that we have been in missions as a family, and it's been such a privilege, and God has brought me back to, even though I didn't just give up my own dreams, but he's using what I have dreamt to fulfill his purpose in the mission field.
Koe tāpua ke au pito, koe tāwene tahaono e maungawe whamisnare, Pea ku neongo ku nai kai ke hange ku kai ke whakahoko, kai ke lava ke whakahoko ai ngahi misi mo ngahi visone, ka ko ngahi wahai tau kone tahao no ki maungai ngā whamasinare, o hanga o tua o ngawe aki ai gift ko ia kune o mai maaku I he ngawe whamisnare.
And so out of these 16 years, I was able to be an ambassador for Christ. I was able to stand up to be a mother that would fight for his children.
I he tau e tahao no koe ni, nau hoko ai koe whakafofonga o kalaisi. I he tau e tahao no koe ni, nau hoko ai ko ha whae ke tuu o fight pa mai whanau. I he taimi ko whae ngai u whaiak.
And so my first ministry was my children.
Koe whaitu koe nau fufua whaia e guako, koe guako e whanau.
So when I first went into missions, my son was only 4 years old, and I asked God, should I put him into school or should, living in Australia as international students, we had to pay international fees, and it was not cheap.
Taimi koe na mau lele atoi ki Australia ki ako oku fuu mamafa au pito ai totong yako koe mau tol koe international students. Pa nau eke rewa koe tua pe koe hae mea te uwhai, pe te homeschool e whanau aho mafoha, pe ave ki he ako.
And so God spoke to me in a verse says, train up your children in the ways of God. And at the same time, I was hearing a testimony from another lady who was a family mission that she had all these kids. And how can you be in missions and have all of these kids? And what I got from her was that it's possible to have children and be a family and still fulfill the mission.
Ye wholofola kune pehe mai maunga ke tauhanga o ako e tau whanau he nau ke iki he ka fulai kai te hiki mea. Pea nau whetaulaki pa mo whiwhine koni o kune homeschool pe ne whanau. Toko lahe ne whanau ngau e full time I he ngai whamisnare.
And so it was from there I said, okay, I can do this. I can raise up my children here in the mission field, and that is my first ministry. And out from that, I was able to pioneer a cooperative homeschool on that YWAM base that we were in Perth.
Pea mea I rewa pau wako I rewa pau homeschool rewa e whanau. Pea na mau kamata I rewa ai homeschool pe koe whakalere ako I he base ko na mau iai Australia.
So the beauty of it is that it's not just made just for the mom or the dad, but missions is made for the family and for the children. And when I was in that, when we started that homeschool, cooperative homeschool, we began our own school, and just I had the privilege of also teaching other kids, not just my own kids.
Oku I he lotonga lele ko ne homeschool ko ni pe na tapua ke te au ka ngata be ku hanga wa ko e ku hokfoha kana u dai to life mo ka ore ka I pe wa ko I na to ko ni ko wa ko I na to.
Yeah, and so that's just my encouragement. You know, this is part of my story. I can keep going on, but to summarize what my story is, that my story is God's story, and everyone's story is going to be different in how God calls you to come. And if God calls you to go into missions, and doing a discipleship training school in YWAM is just a foundational course so that you can grow more intimate in knowing who God is.
Ko ku wahe ko ku talanoa el teu elava peke hoko atu ka ko ku talanoa pe mo ngau tu au fai mo wi pe ko tu ko ngau ko fai mo wi ngau tu au fai mo wi elava peke ne fai ho mo